All right, welcome to Series 3 in Biblical Interpretation. We left off with removing yourself in the 21st century from the context, all right? So the Bible wasn't written to us, but for us. And some think that this is a dangerous statement, but I'm convinced that it's not. All right, so all of us need to understand that we have assumptions that we hold, and we bring these assumptions to the text. All right, and sometimes we have assumptions that we probably have never even given much thought to, and these are filters. And we will, because of this, allegorize texts and events, and which we shouldn't do. Like, you're not David, you're not Moses. These people were types and shadows of Jesus. He is the substance. He fulfilled all things, okay? So if you're worried about a giant in your life that needs to be slayed, rest assured that Jesus is taking care of that. Your rest is in Him. All things are accomplished in and through Him. You're not David. You don't need to slay a giant, okay? That's what I'm sort of trying to get at there, all right? So we have to think about these things, that most of the Old Testament was written to Old Covenant Israel, like the law of God given to Israel through Moses. Psalms were songs to be used in the worship of God by Israel. It doesn't mean we can't do it. I'm just pointing these things out. The prophets spoke warnings to Israel, and most of the New Testament was written to various early apostolic churches or to men like Timothy and Titus. All right, so indirectly we benefit from these writings, but we're not the original target audience. That's the point, okay? They were not written to us, but they're written for us. So the Bible was written in a historical context. Much of it was written to those who lived in a particular time in history. So thus, the Bible often limits its messages to the time in which it was written. Doesn't mean that's not relevant to us. It's applicable to us, all right? There's applicability there. Okay, so I don't want you to be confused. These messages are for us, but there are certain messages that were meant for a particular group of people in a particular time, okay? This is called historical limitation. And what this means is that an event is limited to a group of people or a particular time in history, okay? Jesus died on the cross once. It cannot happen again in history. It was historically limited. That's the basic principle or a truth that most of us assume while we read the Bible, but not throughout the Bible for other events, all right? Like Paul, when he's writing to Philemon, he has to prepare lodging for him. That's not written to us. We cannot prepare lodging for the Apostle Paul. He's no longer alive on this earth, all right? This is an example of historical limitation. This doesn't take away from the authority of the Word of God. It simply recognizes that it was written at a particular time in history in a certain geographical location to a person who is no longer living. Okay? So that brings us to the next point or principle. That besides historical limitation to events, some events are told to a group of people listening to certain things or prophecies that are given to them, again referring to a time in history in a certain geographical location to those group of people in the first century who are no longer living. So this is audience relevance. Sometimes historical limitation and audience relevance go together, but I don't want us to get so bogged down by that we lose sight of our goal in the series, all right? So people will think there's loopholes or double fulfillment or other types of things like that, all right, to consider. But I just want you to know the basic principles that need to be applied first, and then the rest can be teased out later by you and in discussions or whatever you do, okay? Now, in Luke 12:33, Jesus says to sell your possessions and give it to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near, nor moth destroys. Okay, well, this is difficult because the words were addressed to the followers of Jesus. Okay. And the directives in much of the context of the verse parallel the Sermon on the Mount, and that's recorded in the book of Matthew. Many people interpret this now and spiritualize it, okay? But Jesus here wasn't saying to give the proceeds to the church. He said to give them to the poor. And is that for all of us? Did he not realize the consequences that would happen if this is for Christians throughout all time? All right, so then how then do we remove ourselves from that interpretive method if we want to be faithful to the words of Christ? All right, and the answer to interpreting a difficult text like this is not spiritualizing it or allegorizing it to mean that all of us in some general sense should be committed to Christ in this way, because this is true for all of us, but this is not what that text commands. It requires the disciples to sell all they have and to give the proceeds to the poor. That is plain and simple. So how do we deal with that type of a dilemma? Again, historical limitation or audience relevance, all right? And again, do not misunderstand me. The Bible is God's inspired word, and all of it speaks to us. But not every command is a command directly intended for all of those, all of us living throughout all time, especially now in the 21st century, all right? So there's two important things to notice in this text, all right? Jesus was speaking to his 12 disciples, all right? He said this to them. Later in the same chapter, Peter's confused about it and to whom it should be applied, all right? Was it meant for the 12 or was it meant for everyone? Okay, so you have to look in the other parallels and check out Mark and Matthew and all that. Secondly, the context here of this particular command refers to the coming of the destruction to Jerusalem that would happen in 70 A.D. by Christ himself, who will use the armies of Rome to destroy Jerusalem. All right, so shortly after Jesus commanded his disciples to sell all their possessions, he says that you too be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you do not expect. So, should we sell all of our possessions and give them away to the poor because we need to be ready for the Son of God who's coming in an hour that we do not expect? Right? Where he's not talking about the second advent as what we know as the second coming of Christ, okay? He's telling his disciples to prepare for persecution by the Jews and for the loss of all their property and for his coming in judgment. That will be used by the Roman armies. He's not, again, not speaking of the personal, visible advent that we know as the second coming of Christ, all right? But soon, because of the persecution from the Jews, his disciples will have nothing. Once the Roman soldiers are finished with Jerusalem, all surviving citizens will be reduced to poverty. So it's better to sell everything now and give it to charity, because the disciples would soon lose it all anyway. So it's better to have a treasure in heaven than treasure on earth that will soon be taken away and is all subject to decay. This particular historical limitation is the only honest way that we can ever remove ourselves personally from responding to this particular command by selling all we have and giving it to the poor. Now, There is, though, the text can be applied to any generation because materialism is idolatry. So that's application, but it's not obeying the actual command, all right? So that's something that we should know, all right? So this text should not be spiritualized, nor is it a command for every believer in every age to take a vow of poverty. It's a text written to followers of Christ living before the destruction of Jerusalem that would come in 70 AD, with the expectation that they should indeed sell all they owned, give it to the poor before the destruction of Jerusalem. So the text is historically limited and there was audience relevance at hand. That was the final principle to get us to a better understanding and interpreting the Bible so we can ask the question that I want to ask, and that will be in the next video. Again, I have a podcast, the Kingdom Project Podcast. It's on iTunes, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, here on YouTube as well in audio formats. Check it out if you were interested. And as always, thanks for watching. Be a mustard seed, be leaven. Until next time, go serve your King.